Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of everyone here at SCS Global Services, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. I'm your host, Vikas Ahuja, Vice President of Sales. Before we dive into the presentation on EU CBAM regulation, I'd like to take a minute to update you all on our event platform, GoToWebinar. There is a way to engage us as speakers during the webinar. To avoid any unnecessary background noises during the presentation, all attendees have been muted, and this will remain a one-way presentation for the duration of the event. If you would like to ask a question, please go to the questions section in the control panel of the upper right-hand side of your webinar console. Once you type your question and hit send, your question will be sent to me for review. Depending on the time allotted at the end of the presentation, we'll make every effort to answer all questions submitted. But be aware that we can't get to everything. Any questions that we're not able to answer will be responded to after the event by email. Again, my name is Vikas Ahuja. I am the Vice President of Sales at SCS. I am going to be doing the first few slides of the presentation. And then I'll be handing it over to my colleague, Tobias Schultz, the Vice President of Research and Development at SCS, and he will carry through to the end. A little bit about us before we get started. SCS Global Services provides certification, verification, auditing, and consulting for various industries and sectors. We are an innovative company, and we routinely scan the horizon for issues that broadly impact the field of sustainability. After we do a scan of the environment for upcoming regulations and trends in the marketplace, then we develop products and services that help our clients meet the demands of the marketplace. What makes us unique is that our focus is exclusively on sustainability issues. And this is beneficial to our clients because we have a singular focus that allows us to precisely guide our clients to creating a future that safeguards the environment, respects and supports dignity, health, well-being of workers and communities, and raises the standard of living for all. We have been in the same field of sustainability since 1984. Next year will be our anniversary. And we have offices in North America, Latin America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. Our reach is far and wide. We work with companies, government agencies, NGOs, and stakeholders across various industries and sectors to advance sustainable development goals. You'll notice on this slide that SCS has dedicated departments that serve the same industries primarily impacted by the CBAM regulation, such as fuels and transportation, minerals and metals, and agriculture. And because climate change is such a pressing issue and of critical importance to our clients, we have an entire department dedicated to carbon footprinting and life cycle assessment. The history of CBAM. CBAM was first introduced as a part of the European Green Deal, which serves as a guide for both tax and non-tax policy initiatives in the EU to achieve an ambitious target of becoming climate neutral by 2050. This was followed by a proposal for a regulation on CBAM on July 2021 as part of the Fit for 55 policy package. The package aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030. From the baseline levels of 1990. On 2023, the European Parliament adopted rules for the new CBAM. However, there will be a transition phase which started actually already in October 2023. During this phase, EU importers of goods covered in the scope of CBAM regulation will be required to submit quarterly reports of the embedded emissions of these goods to the European Commission. Key items for importers and producers to keep in mind is that the first CBAM reports are due by January 31st, 2024, an important date. These reports must reflect emissions on goods that fall within the scope of CBAM regulation that were imported into the EU member states in Q4 of 2023. Quarterly reports will then be required throughout the transitional period, which ends in December of 2025. Beginning in 2026, and based on the Q4 2025 quarterly report, importers will be required to purchase CBAM certificates in order to pay the tariffs on their imported goods which are in scope. The whole goal of this is to help the EU reach its goal of achieving the 55% greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 2030. Now, it's critical to emphasize that the first CBAM report is due by January 31, 2024, and it covers the current quarter that we're in. So that means that if declarants have not already started the process of collecting data, calculating the footprint, and preparing a report, then they're at risk of missing the first reporting deadline of January 31, 2024. The risk is real because as practitioners ourselves, we can tell you that data collection alone can take up to 6 weeks. We advise declarants to begin the process of calculating their carbon footprints immediately so that the deadline is not missed. CBAM is necessary to account for carbon leakage. Carbon leakage is a situation where companies move production from a country with strict climate policies to a country with less ambitious climate measures. This can lead to a rise in greenhouse gas emissions. Some examples of carbon leakage are industries relocating to countries with lower emission standards, an increase in local fossil fuel prices, or forest carbon projects that have fewer trees than their baseline. Carbon leakage can be a byproduct of global trade. For example, domestic producers can be undercut by imports due to lower labor and capital costs abroad. EU producers are already required to be compliant with EU climate standards implemented several years ago, and they work through the EU Emissions Trading System, or EU ETS. This is where current carbon prices are made available. Non-EU producers need to show that they are also in compliance with these standards by lowering emissions, paying their own country's carbon price, or purchasing CBAM credits to pay for the carbon border tax if required. The amount of CBAM tax assessed is determined by several factors, including the amount of emissions documented, the amount, if any, of country carbon tax already paid in the country of origin, and the differential between the two. If no carbon tax has been paid in the country of origin, then the CBAM tax will be applied in order for the non-EU products to be paid to be in compliance with the CBAM regulation and aligned with the tax paid by EU producers. At this time, like to take a moment to take a poll to see what industries our attendees are currently in. It will just take 30 seconds. This is great. Thank you very much for answering the questions in the poll. It looks like many of our attendees are in industries impacted by the regulation, especially folks in aluminum, iron, and steel. So this presentation is very pertinent to you then. Currently, carbon-intensive sectors such as aluminum, cement, iron, and steel, fertilizers, hydrogen, and electricity are all covered by CBAM, and they will be required to report the product level footprints by January 31st, 2024. If you have any concerns about whether your products are covered by the CBAM transitional phase, there's a link on the screen that will take you to a document that will show a full listing of the products covered. However, it is foreseen that for all the list of covered goods, there will still be more added. So we foresee that the list of covered goods, as well as the target industries, will be extended in coming years to include all products covered by the EU emissions trading system. It is worth noting that in addition to the product classification, the country of origin for source products will also play a role. All right, at this time, I'd like to hand over the presentation to my colleagues, Tobias Schultz, our VP of Research and Development.
Thank you, Vikas. And so I'll start by talking about what the core information that goes into the CBAM report that's submitted to the EU at the time the shipments brought into the EU. and how that relates to product carbon footprints, or what are also called embedded emissions. So CBAM reports, there's a detailed template in the regulation that's submitted by importers, and it contains a lot of the information that might not surprise you that you might already submit during imports. I mean, product type, measures of quantity, country of production. The core information for the CBAM reports, however, relates to the embedded greenhouse gas emissions for a shipment, which you could also call the product carbon footprint of the shipment. And this is measured in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So I'm trying to advance the animation here. I have a nice little diagram that depicts exactly what that is.
Go ahead, Tobias.
There we go. So in order to calculate the CBAM goods emissions and shipment, again, that core metric in the CBAM report, you first take the tons of the product in the shipment, and then you multiply that times the carbon footprint, or the embedded emissions of the shipment. And that's in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per tons of product. So it's once you get to the number of having the carbon footprint and know the tons in a shipment, it's a relatively simple calculation. Just the tons times the embedded emissions per ton gives you this carbon dioxide equivalent total. This is the core information because in 2026, when the tariffs begin, it'll be on this number that the tariff amounts are calculated. So a bit, what is a product carbon footprint? What are embedded emissions? So this is a quantitative evaluation of the greenhouse gas emissions from a product life cycle. And as I said, it's evaluated per ton of product. So it's normalized to the per ton of product according to the CBAM regulation. So if you're familiar with product carbon footprints, maybe your company has done an ISO 14067 product carbon footprint or something like an environmental product declaration. You'll know a little bit about this. Generally, product carbon footprints can include the full entire life cycle, including use, end of life. The required life cycle stages for CBAM include what we would call cradle to gate for a product. So that includes the precursor materials production, the manufacturing of the product, and the electricity generated, or the generation of the electricity used to manufacture the product and the precursor materials. In my next slide, we'll talk a bit more about breaking these different life cycle stages down. All right, so a bit about the life cycle, the supply chain embedded emissions that are included in a CBAM carbon footprint. So you can see my little boxes here. I'll show us a series of boxes that cover the supply chain, and the gray ones are feature locations that are not included in which you have to report in the CBAM report, embedded emissions. The green boxes are the locations that do have to be included. So first green box, this is what the CBAM regulation calls the installation. This is the manufacturing location of the covered product. So if it's an aluminum product, an extruded aluminum, say, this would be the extruding facility. And so that the emissions occurring at that facility are covered. If you go further upstream, the precursor materials that go in, some of them are included, the embedded emissions for those materials. So dwelling more on the aluminum example, if there's aluminum billet, well, there is aluminum billet or some form of aluminum being used at the extruder to produce the final product, then the embedded emissions related to the aluminum billet has to be included as well as the electricity used at the extruder, which is generated off-site by a power plant. Those indirect emissions also have to be included. Now, there are other precursors that would go into extrusion. I don't know, maybe there's polymer additives or something like that that might be used at some stage in the process, or paint, depending what's happening at the extruder. But if it's not if the precursor material is not covered under CBAM, and Vikas talked about what the covered products are now a few slides ago, if it's not a covered product, then it does not have to be counted in the precursor embedded emissions. So you can think of it, there's basically these three categories of inputs to the installation. Two of them have to be covered. That's the relevant precursors and the electricity generation. And one does not, and that's the other precursors that are not covered by CBAM. Now that sort of wrinkle here is that you go further up the supply chain, you still have to continue including the relevant precursors. And that's what makes the true life cycle assessment, product carbon footprint, embedded emissions across the supply chain. So there are two types of CBAM related deliverables, depending on whether your company is an importer or an installation operator, which that's the CBAM terminology. I mean, if you're a product manufacturer, if you're the aluminum extruder, you'd be counted as an installation operator. Although depending on the way that you're importing into the EU, you could be both an importer and an installation operator. So there's two types of deliverables. The first for importers, which is really the cardinal one, the one that the CBAM regulation dictates, are these CBAM reports. As I mentioned, it has this aggregated emissions data on all the import shipments. These CBAM reports are submitted quarterly to EU authorities. So at the end of each quarter, there's a 1 month period. 1 month after the end of the quarter is when the calendar quarter is when it is due. That's why the first CBAM reports are due January 31st, 1 month after the first quarter, whereas the CBAM provisional period has begun. This submission is mandatory for the covered products. For installation operators, there aren't mandatory submissions to the EU, but what is encouraged, recommended, is what's called the CBAM communications template for installations. So this just provides, it's an Excel spreadsheet, pretty complicated one, that includes the embedded emissions that have been calculated for each aggregated goods category and the data that supports it. So this is intended to be submitted not to the EU, but by installations, that is manufacturing facilities, to the importers. So if I'm thinking of this aluminum extrusion example again, so an aluminum extruder outside of the EU has a contract with an importer, say in some country in the EU. Then the aluminum extruder is encouraged to submit their embedded emissions data, tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per ton of product, to the importer to facilitate the reporting process. As I said, the use of this template is recommended, but it is not required for CBAM compliance. So a bit about the CBAM embedded emissions methodology and how to calculate this product carbon footprint. Now, if you're familiar in this space, you know there's other product carbon footprint calculation methodologies. I mentioned ISO 14067. There's also the WRI product carbon footprint standard. CBAM actually has its own methodology. Principles are mostly the same. I would say the largest difference is in which of these precursors are included or not, as well as what's reported when you compare it to an ISO or the WRI standard. And so CBAM categorizes emissions into two. There's direct emissions. So this includes process emissions from fossil fuel combustion, industrial processes, heat and cooling. So this can occur either at the installation, that manufacturing facility, or as embedded emissions in the relevant precursors. And these direct emissions are required for all categories of goods. The second category are indirect emissions. So these are emissions from generating electricity consumed by the production process. So this can occur at the installation or at the installations creating the relevant precursors. It can be calculated based on supplier data or default values that the EU Commission will supply. Indirect emissions are not required for all types of goods. So there's some exclusion, whereas for direct emissions, it all has to be factored in. Slide seems to be hung up. Bear with me. There we go. Okay. So how to calculate a carbon footprint for a product, again, at the very high level picture. So the first is data gathering covering all the direct emissions, or the data required to calculate direct emissions and indirect emissions related to the product that is being manufactured. So for this aluminum extrusion example, this includes calculating the emissions from all the fuels that are used on site at the extruder, any process emissions that might be related, as well as the electricity used at the extrusion facility, as well as for that aluminum billet that's coming into the facility. Similarly, the process emissions and electricity used there. So you essentially get a total number of all these emissions, and you make this very simple, add this all up and get total tons of carbon dioxide equivalent for all the facilities covered by CBAM related to this product's manufacture. Once you have this data, then you take this total tons of carbon dioxide equivalent for all facilities, and then you divide it by the tons of the product manufactured on an annual reporting basis. And this gives you the carbon footprint, tons carbon dioxide equivalent per ton of product. So once you get to that point, it's conceptually fairly simple. Get your total emissions, and essentially you normalize that to the total product manufactured. So what are the steps to complete a product carbon footprint? It begins with collecting data, and what Vikas said is absolutely true. This data gathering phase can take more time than you would think. 6 weeks is a good measure, and that's, if you're able to be pretty active at that data gathering. Once that's done, there's product carbon footprint models. There's different models that can be used, different software tools, and those models, of course, have to follow the CBAM requirements. Once that's completed, product carbon footprint report, which could be included in the CBAM communications template I mentioned. And finally, that embedded emissions per ton of product is used to calculate the total embedded emissions in the CBAM report, as I talked about earlier in the webinar. So if you think of it as very simply, data gathering, data analysis and calculation, report preparation, and then reporting under the CBAM regulation. So SES has a readily deployable CBAM reporting tool. So this can automatically generate CBAM compliant reports and communication templates based on user data entry. It provides access to a curated list of data sets that are relevant to your installation and precursor materials. So we go to the trouble of trying to understand what the EU is requiring and providing for these data sets and build them in. And then if you're an aluminum extruder, again, I'll keep dwelling on that example, then we essentially give you access to the data sets you need to do it with aluminum extrusion. So we don't need to give you all the data sets, but the ones that are pertinent to your product and your location. Our tool also has automatic error checking to notify if you have a submitted data point that's an error. We're also, although there's not a verification required yet under CBAM, we're also able to provide SCS optional third-party review to ensure your data will satisfy EU regulations. You don't trigger some EU inspector or auditor to look twice at the calculations you've done. And that was my section, so I think we're going to do questions now.
That's great, Tobias. Thank you very much. We did have a few interesting questions here. Tobias, for the carbon footprint, are carbon credits possible to lower the embedded emissions?
As far as the current regulation stipulates, no. Tell me if I'm wrong. We have another colleague here at SCS, Kelly McGarry, who's also a subject matter expert, but you cannot offset your footprint, right? Kelly, am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. No offsets can be applied to kind of reduce that, what eventually that tariff bill would be.
All right, thank you. And also, how recent emissions or production data is required for determining the product carbon footprint model suitable for CBAM? Is it the prior year, multiple years? What is the time period that we're looking at?
So generally, it's supposed to be the most recent year, although especially in the transitional period, exceptions are allowed. That's the high level view. Kelly, is there more detail you would add to that?
I think you covered it the previous year. So when you calculate your embedded emissions based on a year of data, that embedded emissions value is valid for the following year until you go around to complete the process again.
Thank you, Kelly. Tobias, I think it was in your section, you referred to a template that is required to satisfy the CBAM. Any information on where that template lives or how to submit it to the regulatory authority?
So the CBAM reports templates. So the specific data points that have to be submitted are in the CBAM regulation itself. If there's Kelly, do you know if there's an actual Word or Excel document template for an actual CBAM report that the Commission has made available?
Yeah, so for the CBAM reports, the reporting declarants or the importers, they'll have access to the CBAM registry, and I think they should be able to access a reporting template there.
All right, thank you. We got 3 really good questions there. All right, well, we have reached the end of our presentation. If there are no further questions, we will conclude the presentation at this time. And you'll be receiving a follow-up email from us with links, and we will not be making this exact presentation available, but we'll be making content from it available and making ourselves available to answer any questions for you. So thank you very much for joining us. We're excited to continue talking to our clients who have joined us today, and we are excited to talk to anybody new who would like to learn more about our services and the CBAM regulation. Thank you very much. Have a great day.